So, how long have you been dancing, and do you primarily lead or follow?
I started dancing in 1997, which I calculated today means 17 years. So that was kind of startling. Through that time, I've primarily led, but I've also followed in ballroom, Argentine tango, and blues, but always was more proficient at leading.
Now, why do you dance, and why did you start dancing?
I love this question. I started dancing to meet chicks. So my story is, as a freshman in high school, I was at an all-boys Catholic high school, and I needed to get out. And one of the ways that I found pretty quickly was dancing. And I found it swing dancing, and it was a wonderful thing. I made lots of friends, and in very short order, I decided not to date anybody that I found dancing because I didn't want it to ruin anything. And I had seen too many of my friends get into relationships with people from dances, and it was such a small community. It didn't work, and I really loved the dancing, and so for quite a few years I didn't, and then inevitably I came back to it, and I did start dating within dancing, and it was a thing. But that's the honest answer as to why I started. And then you were asking why do I dance now?
Yeah.
I dance now because it's a challenge. And for me, I've developed this into something that's challenging on a number of levels. It's challenging as a sport, which I really enjoy that aspect of it. It's challenging to me as an art form because I don't consider myself artistic, and it really flexes that and brings that out, as does working with someone like Julie Brown, who's very artistic and very adept at those kind of things. And I feel like I'm constantly, taking guidance from her on that, and that's a big thing to help me keep me well-rounded. The third thing I think would be business. I'm in a position where I do business as a dance instructor, and I really enjoy it. I enjoy the challenge of it. I enjoy making some money, and I mostly enjoy developing that as a way to help people. And if I didn't believe that I was helping people, I wouldn't be doing this. And if I could find a way to do this for free that could reach the same number of people, I would really consider that. But setting up a really solid business structure for the types of business that I do is the best way to reach the most people and help the most people. And that I find very, very rewarding.
So, how does dancing make you feel?
For me, dancing is primarily a social endeavor. So it helps me feel connected. It helps me feel that I'm a part of a community. Even when I'm only in that community for a few days sometimes, I'm embraced and welcomed, and I believe I would have that experience whether or not I was an instructor or a visitor or a guest. And I've had that experience over many years of traveling and going out, and that's the biggest feeling that I love from it. Being able to contribute within a community and create things that are really of great value to people. The other aspect of it is being able to find those rare flow states where your capacity and the challenge match each other, and you lose track of time, and you're one with the moment and the person you're dancing with. And I've been able to achieve that with things like rock climbing and other challenges, but this is fundamentally one sport in which you get to do it with direct contact with one other person and one other mind that's also engaged in the same exercise. And that flow state is really powerful. And I seek those moments out, I think, like everyone else does.
Now, how would you describe blues dancing?
Ah, I personally dislike this question. I find that most other dances don't have to go through the same hoops that blues has. No one asks that question about Argentine tango or ballroom dancing, maybe just because they're more generally known and famous. But my stock answer for that at a low level is it's swing dancing to blues music because it's in the same history and vernacular, and for the person on the street, that's really all they're looking for. The deeper, the deeper answer to that would be that this is a really fun dance surrounded by really fun, embracing, welcoming people. It's very easy to learn, but you can achieve a very high mastery of it as well, so it's not a boring dance. There's plenty of challenge, but it's very accessible and friendly, and there's really, really good music, which is something that in, for example, ballroom communities sometimes goes by the wayside. They're more interested in the dance form than the music form, and I really like the balance that's achieved in blues as a community. Oh, and I guess I can keep going because I made notes, which I did because I prepare for everything, which is ridiculous. The third way I would describe blues dancing is it's an earthly, balanced, improvised, polycentric dance. So if someone asks me about the actual mechanics of the dance, I would say it's deeper into the ground, it's more balanced and rooted physically than a lot of other dances that are contemporary and common right now. And one of the biggest things is that it's improvised, and it's improvised with a partner, which is very appealing to some people.
Where do you dance, and how do your experiences with blues dancing vary from one space to another?
So I'm really fortunate that I get to dance lots of places. My hometown is Los Angeles, and we have two main blues venues here. We have Do Something Blue, which is our more traditional blues venue, and we've got Blues Liberation Front, which is kind of verging on a turquoise, more open, ecstatic sort of event where not as many people are interested in learning the craft of blues, but they're really interested in the culture and the community of it, and those are great. And I've also got the opportunity to travel a lot, nationally and internationally, and the variation in space is huge. And the communities, and again, for me, it's really about touching people and being able to understand why they're dancing and then to try and contribute to that. Because if I can't contribute either as a dancer or as an instructor or as a business person, then I'll take my leave and I'll go. One thing about variation is that I actually wish there was a lot more of it. A few years ago, before the national blues scene really solidified itself in the form that it is today, you would go to different cities and they would have completely different styles of what is recognizably blues. And there were regional styles, and there were styles within styles, and these things still exist today at some level, but the homogenization that's been created from the top-down instruction is something that I look at, and it's not something I regret. I just wish the other side was a little more balanced, and that usually develops through more grassroots, local organizing and development of their dancers, and having the strength locally to both incorporate national ideas that you would find at a blues shout or a blues muse, and then also being able to come home and incorporate that into what you're doing. And that's the next step that I want to see from the national level scene, and it gets me really excited.
So you've already kind of touched on this, but has blues dancing changed since you first began, and in what ways?
It's changed so much, and it's really important to reflect upon it and see what that's all about from both a consumer standpoint and a producer standpoint. And I'm one of the very fortunate people who gets to, in my small piece, guide what is nationally considered blues dancing. And I take that honor and that responsibility very, very seriously. So, I mean, years ago, I think I had my first experience with blues in maybe 2005, and it was this dinky little house party that happened after the Lindy party, and nobody knew what they were doing, but there was this weird music playing, and all my favorite people were there, and people were just going for it, and no one understood, and it didn't matter as much, and everyone went for it, and that was lovely. It was really nice. And what's happened is as blues has progressed and developed into the definition of what it is today, it's changed, and that's fine. It's less sexy. It's more challenging. There's more mechanics and technique than there used to be readily available. It used to be that if you were a good dancer, you would come in and you would do this thing to mess around with. Now you can actually come all the way up through the ranks and be a blues dancer, which I think is a really wonderful addition to what we had at the beginning. And there's more historical appreciation of the roots and history without it being tethered to them. I'm a big advocate of innovation, and while I study and read on blues history, that's not where it stops. The other thing academically that's really interesting about the progression of blues in the last few years is that there's been almost a reverse cultural appropriation that's happened. And when you see a room full of white kids dancing to historically black music at a black dance in a way that doesn't look like what the history books tell us this dance looked like, there's an appropriation that's happening there. And in certain times and places, that can be a very difficult thing for the appropriated culture. We're fortunate in this day and age that the appropriated culture was kind of finished about 40 or 50 years ago at best. And so it's not as complicated of an issue anymore, and it's not something that we all revere. I'm not trying to emulate young black men in the 1930s who were dancing this, in New England. I'm trying to create something that pays homage to that and uses that lineage, but that's not where it needs to go. So when we talk about the change from those initial house parties to where we're going today, I find that very interesting academically, that we're bringing in culture, but we're also trying not to lose our identity in the same process. And for someone like myself who's teaching so much across the U.S. and across the world, being very careful to let people know why this is important, but also let them know where it shouldn't limit you. And so that's one of the large conversations that I hear a lot about today. I think it's the new conflict that's here with us, and I think it's a great one. I think it's a good conflict.
Now, how does dancing with different partners impact your experience?
This question is a little hard to answer because I've only done that kind of dancing. I've never had an experience where I've danced only with one person. If I were in a square dancing community, you typically go there with a partner, or you go there and you partner up with someone for most of the evening. And there is some partner shifting, but it is recognized who you came with and who's going to be your primary dance partner for the evening. But in blues and Lindy and ballroom and tango, you're switching partners a lot. And so it's normal to me. The most important part of that for me is the social experience, is being able to touch someone physically and emotionally, to be able to engage with somebody in a way that we don't get to do in normal life. To have a room full of people that you can have a real commitment to and a connection to for a full song, at least one song, and then be able to have that contact, both literal and implicit, have that be a good thing, and have it have a termination date as well, that it can end gracefully, and you can pick it up whenever you want to as well. And that for me is a very big part of being able to dance with multiple partners. It's a wonderfully rare form of embodied experience that we get to share with something that approximates the general public, because in our day in life we typically don't get to touch anybody, and I think that's a big thing within our modern culture.
Now, in your opinion, do men and women experience dancing differently?
Yeah.
Tell
okay,
me more.
No more. Yeah. Well, fundamentally, if we're talking about men and women, there are 4 or 6 different things we can talk about here. We can talk about leads and follows. We can talk about genetic men and women with a gray zone in the middle, because that exists and we need to recognize that. And then we can also talk about gendered male and female. So if we start with gendered male and female, I think that question is fairly tautological, that by asking the question, it is true. If you consider yourself male, you're going to see the world through a male lens. That's what that means. That's what the training is. I look at things as a man, and I frame my world from a male perspective, and that's what gender studies tells us happens. And I also don't have nearly as much insight or aspect into how it would be for someone else to view the world or the dancing world from a female perspective. And I wouldn't myself, having not done that, assume that I would know much about it. So that's one. And then if we want to talk about mechanically the sport, the difference in experience between leading and following, I think there's an obvious difference there too. There's different roles and responsibilities, but it's really important to pull those apart. One of my favorite analogies that I love to use in speaking, but never in class, is the lead as driver, the car analogy. And most people who go through some sort of social dance experience or training hears this analogy at some point. The problem is if you're imagining the lead in the front seat and the follow in the back seat, that doesn't automatically set up a power dynamic. You can imagine different scenarios where those are different things. Maybe there's a policeman in the front seat and someone who's being taken to jail in the back seat. That's a clear power dynamic. Maybe it's a chauffeur in the front seat driving and a very well-off person in the back seat who's calling the shots and making things happen. That power dynamic can go either way, which is why I really refuse to use the driver analogy. It's not apt, and it's too easy to make parabolic. It's too easy for people to read into it what they already want to see. And so it doesn't engage in one of my goals in teaching, is to show people the options that are inherent in this dynamic, that this very simple dynamic based on movement can fit many, many types of relationships and power structures. And if we want to talk about power, I often feel when I'm dancing with someone like Julie Brown, I feel as though I'm trying to be there doing her service. I feel halfway between a chauffeur and being chauffeured. I feel that we both hold power, and I hold my partners, no matter if it's Julie or anyone else, I hold them in such high esteem that I don't presume I'm the one calling the shots. And most of the leading I do is in response to the balance and posture and movement and skill and style of the person who I'm touching. So that's really important for me to convey, both academically or verbally, and also when I'm teaching. I try to make sure that I don't let any words out that would directly imply otherwise, because it's important that people are able to create the relationships that they want through this paradigm that we want to maintain of leading and following. If there's no lead and follow, I don't think it's blues dancing anymore, or at least it's solo blues, or, in a partner context. So, I don't think there's anything there to it in terms of power. I think that's something people put on top of an existing relationship in lead and follow.
So how would you describe masculinity and femininity?
I like this one. So I think there's a really important distinction that needs to be made, that categories change and definitions change. And what was correct. And what is now. And it's important for people to make that distinction. I see a lot of conflation when this issue comes up. So masculinity and femininity was an idealized caricature used to categorize people and also to force them into behaving in certain ways. That is absolutely what it was. And to this day, we can have long conversations about how much that persists, but we can all agree that that's what it was in Western historical context. The world is a big place, and it's been around a long time, and there are many, many other, exceptions to that rule. But as a general starting point, we can start there. Masculinity and femininity, as I see them today, speaking from a personal perspective, and I wrote this down because I spent a little time on it, because I know I can feel it, but putting it into words is an interesting exercise. For me, both masculinity and femininity today, I feel, are a sense of confidence and correspondence with your physical body, its attributes, and its limitations. The way I kind of expound upon that is, I feel masculine, and I choose to dress and perform in what is recognized as a masculine way. I don't try to be masculine. I don't spend time thinking about that. But the fact that I have confidence that I have the build that I do, that I generally have more upper body strength than the average female, the average sexualized female, that I have smaller hips than a woman typically does. There are certain pieces of me that are bigger and smaller, and the idea that I have knowledge of that, and that I have confidence in that, and that I use those pieces of data to inform how I act and behave, I find that to be masculine. Likewise, femininity is also a correspondence and a confidence between the physical body, its attributes and limitations. So if a given woman, a particular person, a body, is weaker than mine, that is something that should be embraced with confidence. If it is a body that is softer than mine, more elegant than mine, has more visually appealing curves than mine, that is also something that should be embraced with confidence. You know, if a woman had lovely upper dimensions, and and that woman was comfortable expressing those and wearing shirts that accented her breasts and put that out into the world because that's what made her feel confident, I would consider that femininity. As would I if a woman of the same build wore a sports bra and dressed more conservatively, but still owned that piece of her body. So long as that confidence, that correspondence, so long as there's a correspondence and a confidence between the body that isn't hiding it, as long as that's present, I consider that masculinity and femininity, and I find that attractive in both. I don't find self-doubt very attractive in any context, be it personal, sexual, or professional. What I'm looking for is someone who understands their body and is able to work with it, especially in a sport that requires physical touch. So, yes.
So how about masculine and feminine movement?
I try not to. I don't ever think about my movement being masculine. And it's actually a funny thing as I was thinking about it today. Earlier on when I was training very hard in blues dance, when I was going to lots of workshops and taking copious notes on everything and really trying to visually analyze dancing for what I wanted out of it, I was trying to emulate the women because they were, to my eye, the best dancers. I tried to move my hips like a woman. I tried to move my arms like a woman, and failed, but I tried. I also looked at the men and I took from them what I considered to be good movement that would fit, again, on my body, that I could have masculine confidence in. And it's only masculine because it's my body. If my body, wasn't mine, I would be looking for other things and I'd be trying to achieve different things, I feel. Other people, not too many, but other people have said that I look very masculine when I dance. And I say thank you. And that's really nice. And if what they see is masculine, that's great. But it's not something I spend any time thinking about or attempting to achieve unless I'm teaching a class on masculine or feminine movement, which is always an interesting topic. So in some, I try to move confidently. And if I move confidently, people respond to that. And that's kind of as much thought as I put into that in terms of my own personal dance craft.
So you do teach classes in gendered movement? Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, gosh, this feels like a therapy. Do you want to talk about that? Yeah, there haven't been too many. The two that stand out, there was one that I got to teach with Dan Legenthal, and he and I did at an event. Oh, God. It was in Chicago. We taught together in Chicago at Winter Blues Intensive, and we were asked to do a masculine solo blues class. And the thing, we were both a little worried and anxious about it, about saying the wrong thing, or drawing up some caricature of some, belching, overweight man, who smells bad. Like, what is masculine to the general public, and what are people expecting, and then what can we teach upon those expectations? And so we were a little worried about it. And we basically rocked it. And I really thank him for his input in that class. It was a wonderful class. And It went terrifically, and um, everyone in the class, the feedback that we got on it was that it was not hegemonic, and we had a lot of women in that class, and it went very well. And in fact, I remember two women in particular came up to us afterwards and said that this has opened up so many possibilities in their dancing that they never saw, and they were really thankful for that. And one of the big themes in that class was that one of the best ways to perform a stereotypical male or female role would be to do the other role for a little bit, so that by contrast you look even more feminine or masculine. And we like that concept a lot. But yeah, the other class that I had long ago, and I haven't been asked to teach it, and I haven't offered it in a long time, is how to lead like a woman and how to follow like a man. And it was a switch class, and everyone in the class was asked to switch dancing roles. And what we tried to maintain and retain in that class was a sense of body movement that was true. And this was kind of a larger project to disassociate in their heads the idea that leading is masculine and following is feminine. It was very important to us that we pull that apart. So by trying to honor women who wanted to lead and saying, no, you should still lead with the same body awareness and the same movement choices that you're used to making, you can lead like a woman. And likewise, when I follow, I try to follow like a man. I don't try to make my movements effeminate or caricature what I think would be effeminate. I try to lead the same way I move, and my skill as a follower is not as great as that as a lead, but I try to make all my movements as confident as possible. And again, I feel that that confidence taps into my definition of gender.
So do you feel there are any pros or cons to teaching movement as masculine or feminine?
There's a lot of trade-offs, and as I was kind of getting into, there are risks. So one of the pros is that by juxtaposition and by contrast, we can learn more. So if we take two movement styles and we call one of them masculine and we call the other one feminine, that can be very illustrative. It can be useful to see something new. Where it can be a con, and where the instructor has a lot less power, which makes it very risky, is in engaging in automatic assumptions. One of the biggest assumptions would be that masculine leading or masculine dancing is aggressive, and that feminine leading or feminine following is passive. And allowing people to hear that in words of mine that weren't intended that way is something I worry about. There's a very real worry that leading, because of what it's supposed to be doing and changing the weight of both partners, can become too aggressive. It can become dominating. It can become leveraged and harmful and physically painful. And when, I should say if, men think that they're supposed to do it that way because leading is masculine, that's a big risk. I also find a big risk in the development of follows as dancers, because if follows fundamentally link up an idea of passivity with their femininity, and they never get past that, following isn't passive. Following is a very active, intelligent endeavor. And if a follow is only willing to be along for the ride and only a passive partner in this sport, in this piece of art, then it is hamstrung. You know, the development of that thing will never come to fruition, and it doesn't work. And I do see a lot of follows get stuck there, and I see a portion of men get stuck in the idea that they are supposed to control the dance. And I feel that there's fairly widespread agreement among the more advanced dancers and the instructor types in this country that that has been let go of. That the leads really are keying into and responding to and obeying their follows. And all of the great follows that I have my experiences with have terrific amounts of voice, and when they want something, they tell me. And it's very important that it's not a passive type of femininity that's laid on top of their following, and those are very different endeavors.
In what ways do you express your gender identity while dancing? Do your movements, clothing choices, and/or character reflect your gender?
So I was having trouble with this question as well. It feels slightly tautological because if I dressed as blandly as I could, I would be perceived as male. It would take effort and work for me to be perceived as sexually female. And to be perceived as legitimately gendered female would arguably take even more work than that. So it's an interesting question. I don't try to express my gender, but at the same time, I don't have any problem wearing collared shirts and pants. So I recognize that there is a gender performance that I am buying into and that I'm performing and that I'm doing. But it's not something I labor over, and it's not something I'm not trying to be a hyper-masculine authority. I'm not trying to be or become something. My main goal in the way I comport myself in dress and in dance, the way I try to comport myself mostly in the way I dress and behave at a dance, I try to make most things invisible so that the thing that is most visible is my dancing. If I were to wear a dress to a dance, I feel as though more people would not notice my dancing. And when I go, especially as a professional, to do this, my dancing is my craft. It is what I do, and it is what I'm there to do. And by wearing anything, if I was wearing, a giant pink zoot suit, which is very masculine, it would distract from what I'm actually trying to have people see of me. So, no, I don't try to be gendered, but I also don't confront it head on because it would not enable my goals when I'm out dancing.
Do you feel you accentuate femininity or masculinity for competition or performance?
Yes. Absolutely I do. And part of it is the passive gendering that I allow myself to do, again, by wearing certain clothes, speaking with what I recognize as a normal voice, which would be at a generally, deeper tone than a woman. I'm not trying to hide it. I'm not trying to change it. And I also recognize that this is how I've learned to speak as a man. And so there's a passive gendering that's happening, and there's also some element of an active gendering, especially when we bring in competition. I don't try to be, again, a caricature or a costumed man when I dance. I try to move in a way that's as confident as possible, that speaks to the music, and that collaborates best with what my partner's trying to do. Those are all really important to me. Oh gosh. So there have been several performances that I've seen in many dance crafts, and in recent years, most of my dancing has been blues. But there have been wonderful performances that play on gender. I've seen performances done by people in drag going both ways. I've seen performances where people take spoof on the other sex and the other gender, and they're terrific. They're wonderful, and they show something that isn't readily seen or available in a performance aspect. And I think that's really important in that aspect, and I think that's really great. When we take it out of a strictly performance aspect and we want to talk about something a little more candid and real, a few years ago there was a guy, and he made it into the finals of a very big event and a very big competition. And that evening he showed up in a dress. And I was very, very happy for that, because that person showed up as a lady. And at that event, everyone was dressed to a certain level of attire. And I was wearing a tie and a jacket, nice shoes. I had my hair combed and, very well put. And the ladies all came out dressed to the nines. And this person who decided that she was more comfortable in those clothes, she came out and she abided by all of the things that show respect to everyone else in the room. This person wasn't putting on a display to be distracting. They were doing this to feel better and more confident about themselves. And that confidence came out in their performance and in their competition. And I thought it was a wonderfully powerful thing. And I always look to that as an example of a very good application of a gender switch or a gender performance that may have offended other people. But I didn't hear one thing about that. And it was a lovely thing to have everyone take a moment to recognize it happened and then have it completely not matter. That was nice.
So maybe from a judging perspective, what do you think about dancers accentuating masculinity or femininity for competition or performance?
From a judging perspective, it's a conversation that has been started by different judges. I don't abide by it at all. I don't think it's as important. I think that I have not accepted a reasonable argument why I should look to those things. In the past, if we want to talk about tradition, women have worn lots of different things over decades and decades and over through many cultures, and just within the U.S. alone, so many regional variations in styles on dress and culture, going from, all of the many different segments of African culture, which we keep tapping upon, and also, white Anglo culture and Hispanic culture. There's so many places that can all come in. And so to insist upon one of those readings of femininity and holding that over a competitor, I really can't find grounding in that, and I don't find it to be helpful to the progression of this dance. On the masculine side, I can say much the same thing. Masculinity, in my opinion, historically has been more bland. Men get to wear shirts and pants, and the shirts change over time, ties change over time, but really, I feel a little more constrained in that way. But if I were to hold someone's movement to a certain aesthetic style just because of their gender, I really don't even know what that would look like. If someone was very confident in their movements and moved in a way that someone else felt was not appropriate in a gender context, I would really go to bat against that person and try and have them explain what they mean by that. So, no, I really try to not let gender in any significant way. I do feel, and this might be a caveat to that, I do feel that it's very important to dress respectfully. And so whether you choose to dress as a male or a female, you should do it well. And I don't think that that's too much to ask. If someone showed up to a dance wearing a tail and bunny ears, that would be a big distraction for me from their dancing. If they're trying to do that, then there has to be expectations that I'm going to be distracted by that as a judge. I'm going to do my best to look through it, but I would probably have words with a person who I thought in some way might have been making a mockery of something I love. So long as someone performs with confidence and respect, they generally have my respect.
Do you believe that age is a factor in how a person might express their gender on the dance floor specifically?
No. I think there are other much better correlates than age. I think that culture and upbringing, some people would like to parry into that political leanings, although I think that's another poor correlate. There are so many things that could factor into how someone else thinks. I haven't seen much of it, and of course I'm in Los Angeles. It's a place where these things are common, or at least more common, and I really don't hear much pushback that correlates with age difference on how people express themselves on the dance floor. I just don't see it.
Now, I understand you've done research on dance and gender from a sociological perspective. What can you tell me about your research and your findings?
Well, thank you so much, Grace, for asking. That's very sweet of you. That was, in fact, very nice of you to ask. I do have a background in sociology, and I did some of my research on dance. And it informs a lot of the thinking that I do constantly. The research that I did, I started my research as an undergrad researching the commercialization of human touch. And I researched massage therapists, and I researched dance as a place to get touch, and another venue that was popular back then, which was something called cuddle parties. And it was a place where you would pay, and you would show up, and there were rules put in place and exercises, and people would just touch each other in a very non-sexual, appropriate way for a few hours. And it was all getting at this idea that we live in a very disembodied society. You and I are chatting over Skype. There is no way I can have a physical, embodied interaction with you, even though we're trying to simulate one through video. So my thinking on this began there, and from there it developed into a master's thesis which focused on paralinguistics, which is the thing next to body language. So if there's spoken language, which I'm using right now, body language, which I'm using with my hands, then over here there's paralinguistics. It's all about where you sit in the room, certain types of posture and alignment, where you choose to be, who you choose to be around or next to, where the bathroom is, or where the kitchen is, or where the table is. It's about the placement of bodies in space. And what I found there in terms of gender was that things were largely the same. Men and women would use the same paralinguistics, but would use very different body language and linguistics to express themselves in a dance. And then, of course, in the dance language itself of leading and following, it was mostly gender normative. Mostly women were following and mostly men were leading. I did this research in Tango Milongas in Los Angeles, and it was really nice to see that these fairly fundamental ways of communicating, of being, of placing yourself in a room, were largely gender neutral, and that was nice. The biggest thing that I found that I use constantly in my blues teaching is the idea of history as myth. When people tell histories, they do it for a point. People tell histories like they tell the Cinderella story. They tell it the same way that they tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. They tell it as precautionary tales. They tell stories through history that tell you how to behave or how we think we should behave. And the interesting thing is when those behaviors change, the stories change. It doesn't go the other way around. Stories are used as educational tools, and they bend so pliantly to whatever people want to believe. The actual histories in Argentine tango, for example, which is seen as a very macho dance, there's a very interesting and very complex gender history there. And it starts with the black caballeros, and it goes all the way through into the barrios of Buenos Aires, and how things there were growing, but they were never respected because the dance was a black dance. It was also very, very sexy, much sexier than the Argentine tango we have today. It looked a lot like what blues dancing looked like about 12 years ago. A lot of grinding on the floor. It looked like the really old school slow drag. We have pictures that people have painted because they didn't have cameras, and it looks like that type of blues dancing, and it's really interesting. What happens today, the story that gets told today is about, in the brothels of Buenos Aires, the women, they would dance with the men, and this is how they would negotiate. That never happened. It didn't happen. There is no historical evidence I could find for that happening in any sustained or significant way. And the 89-year-old tango milongueros that I interviewed, who were around near that time or would have heard those stories, they have never heard those stories from anyone in Buenos Aires except the children who are now telling those stories. Those stories are used as a way today to speak about women in a certain specific power context that they're trying to emulate for their dancing now. So even though that history isn't accurate, they tell that story. In blues, we're going through the same process. We're telling stories about what's authentic and what's not, and what's real blues and what's not. there is so much literature and so little video that we can make this whatever we want. We can tell any stories we want to tell. We just have to decide as a community what's important to us, and people will make up the history. And hopefully we'll have a few, dedicated academics who keep us a little truer to it. But this is, from my perspective, a very natural flow, and it's inevitable and something to be not celebrated, but something to be embraced, and it's something to acknowledge, and it's something to not let drive us into something. And I don't believe it is a driver. I believe it's a follower to behaviors that people want to push. So that is a big, big part of my study and how it informs my theory on how I try to promote blues dancing across the world. There's also the idea that I mentioned before of cultural appropriation. And when we took those dances, that Argentine tango from the barrios of Buenos Aires, the way it got famous was the French. The French Parisians came down and they wanted to slum it. They went out to the dirty black dances. And they went and they found this thing. And then they went back to France and they said, guess what I learned? It's sexy and it's dangerous and our parents will hate it. And they did it. And as soon as they did it, the upper-class Argentinians who lived in the center of the city and had wealth and means, they said, no, that's ours. That's our dance. And they took it back. So we have this wonderful illustration of a re-cultural appropriation, and I think we can learn a lot about that, of what's going on in the blues community right now today. We have appropriated a culture, as I said, that is largely gone. Or at the very best, that, to my knowledge, not many of us have contact with. Very, very few people have contact with people who, in a more original sense, did blues dancing before the swing revival. That's a rare commodity, and it's a thing. But it's also been whitewashed. And I don't think that needs to be a dirty thing. What happened was this culture was viewed upon and taken, and I dare say respected now, and it was moved into a place where it fit the needs of people who needed something. And that's very important. And the progression of what was happening after late-night Lindy dances, moving from that into a dance that has some history that we've laid on top of it, because those dances were existing before the history. Someone didn't pick up a book and said, hey, let's create this. People danced and later said, hey, this looks like the thing in the book. It's another story of behaviors. It's another mythology that follows behavior. And I love that this is happening again, because if you look across any major blues dance in the United States, or arguably across the world, you're not going to find nearly as many black people as white people or Hispanic people or any other people in that dancing. And I think that that's something to be celebrated. Much like B.B. King, when he started playing to white audiences, someone asked if he had a problem with that, and he said, no, I love it. And so bringing that, recognizing that cultural appropriation and paying homage and respect, while still not letting that hold us back, and recognizing that we use these stories because they're useful. We don't re-engage these stories because I'm trying to be a black person from the early 20th century. We use these stories because they help us. And if those cultures can feel respected by that contribution of their history and their lineage to us, then I think that's a win-win proposition. And that's what I like to celebrate and work toward. And so my studies in cultural appropriation influence that. And I hope for the betterment of everyone involved, the people who we are borrowing from, and us for doing the work to create something new, which is, I think, equally important.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share on anything we talked about or didn't talk about?
I want to reiterate the part about costuming. Mm-hmm. So long as there's respect happening, I feel very strongly that people are to be respected. And if a person shows up trying to be overly provocative, and I think the word provocative is a very good word for this. If someone shows up dressed incredibly scantily as a man or a woman, I've seen men show up in tank top shirts and wearing very, very way too tight fitting pants, or wearing sweatpants with no underwear. I've seen women at dances with far too much cleavage where there's a risk of popping out, women not wearing dance pants if they're wearing skirts, or if someone's wearing something for the purpose of being provocative and distracting, or if someone is challenging gender norms in a way that is not helpful to them and their identity and their confidence, but is done primarily to be distracting, I find that very disrespectful. And I have strong feelings about that. But by and large, the gender performances I see going on are all very respectful. And they're done with the intent of personal confidence. And it doesn't cross that bridge into what I would consider to be rude and vulgar and provocatively distracting behavior. I think it's very important not to be costuming and to be trying to show respect to everyone around you. And if that happens, we'll have a good community. And by and large, I think blues is a wonderful dance and a wonderful sport. I think it's run by great people and attended by wonderful people. I think people are creating value and people are creating community. And I think they're doing it in a way that, is able to attract people that benefit greatly from this. And it's benefited me greatly, and I'm honored and thrilled that I have a chance to pay back in certain ways. And I always want to keep touch with that, and I never want to let my ego get away with it and think that I have some power, because really I'm here to serve. I'm here to do a service to other people. And I think that by creating those kinds of communities and by making whatever contribution I can to those communities, I think that's a good and appropriate goal for a dance. Because really, at the end of the day, it's a dance, and it's important, and it means nothing at the same time. And if people weren't dancing this dance, they'd find another one, but they would have to find a community. And I think that's the bottom line, and finding a place where people can be comfortable in terms of gender and identity is what's really necessary, and I hope everyone can find that place eventually.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time on this. It's really great to hear what you had to say.
This was fun. I hope a few people watch it all the way to the end.
Well, we'll see. I hope so too.